Hi, 12. So, this is a quick analysis of Rhapsody on a Windy Night. And before we start looking at the poem, let's remind ourselves of some important context. So, as we're going to discuss, we're going to think of Rhapsody as a journey into consciousness. And the reason Eliot chose this as a subject for a poem is that the modernists were very interested in the inner workings of the mind. And the man who was most influential in that regard was Sigmund Freud. So Freud, as we know, pioneered the concept of the subconscious, which goes on to have a profound impact on how we think about reality and the concept of the self. So he postulated that the subconscious was our true selves existing below the surface of our active and conscious selves. And Freud believed that it was a worthwhile pursuit to focus on our minds, to take ourselves seriously, and to invest time in ourselves. And, when he develops psychoanalysis as a kind of like secular confession, it's in the attempt to bring to light the subconscious and the subconscious mind. So, as a result of Freud's pioneering work, modernist works they were really influenced by him, and I've got some of the ways in which they were. We can see that influence. So. Many texts focused on individuals and their conflict with society. They focus particularly on the inner lives of individuals and the struggle to find their true selves. So we see the rise of first-person fiction. Symbolism, which is in part inspired by the significance of dreams and interpreting dreams. But also here we've got modernist works, privileged characters who achieved a truer self or realization where they were able to reconcile the subconscious and the conscious lives of themselves or their characters. And so we get often in modernist works a moment of epiphany, of realization, some profound insight into themselves or the world. And we'll certainly see that in Rhapsody. So when we look at Rhapsody, we think of it, or we can think of it, as Francis Dickey says here, as a surreal dive into memory and irrationality, a journey into consciousness. So if this is a poem about consciousness, what does Eliot find there? Well, to distill the poem down, he finds three things. He finds fracture, hope, and despair. And we're going to look at each of these three ideas and examine how Eliot represents them. So, fracture. So I've written here, in Rhapsody, Eliot represents consciousness as chaotic, irrational, and fractured. In this representation, Eliot reflects the modernist view of the human condition as broken and debased due to the failure to reach a communion between mind and body, intellect and intuition, the conscious mind and the subconscious. So, this fractured existence is reflected in the dichotomies that exist throughout the poem. And each of these dichotomies inform one another, and together they sort of form this significant, or they form a series of significant motifs in the poem. So we have memory and matter. So memories, the reminiscence comes of sunless, dry geraniums. This is the remembrance that the narrator reflects on, and we've got matter, the actual physical material world around him. Regard the woman. It's the woman that inspires that journey into memory. So memory and matter, order and chaos. Order, we've got the streets, which are ordered in blocks, and time, clock time, which ticks away in neat divisions. And the mind is originally represented as having clear relations, its divisions and precisions, which eventually melt away. They dissolve in the light of the moon. And opposing order, we've got chaos, right? And an image that I chose to represent chaos is that one of midnight shakes the memory as a madman shakes a dead geranium. It's sort of this lunatic, irrational image. Artifice and nature, the dichotomies there sort of represented. You've got the street light, which is this artificial source of illumination, and the moon, which is this natural one. And it is the moon that inspires that kind of journey into memory. It inspires that sort of chaotic response or illogical response. And then the body and the mind. So we've got the street and the mind as well. So there are just a couple of images. And so these dichotomies, or the juxtaposition of these dichotomies throughout the poem, represents the dualisms that seem to define existence. These dichotomies seem to remind us that we are fundamentally divided, and that the human condition is broken. And this fractured view of consciousness is, as Jules Spears-Brooker argues, it's dramatized in the use of the French technique of dedoublement, or dividing the self in two. So the audience hears the dual voices of the man as he walks through the street, and his consciousness traveling through the free association of images. As Brooker suggested in that last quote, the purpose of doing this is to experiment with Bergson's philosophies. So we can see Rhapsody as being kind of an intertextual conversation with Bergson. And Bergson offers hope. He believes that we can bring an end to dualism with conscious effort, understanding the world around us not in purely quantitative terms like clock time, or in the body like practical memory, but in qualitative terms like duration, or in the spirit like pure memory. So Eliot experiments with this idea. His narrator is putting it to the test. Can he overcome those dualisms? If he's successful, then the intellect will melt into consciousness, leading to the transcendence of the divided self, as Brooker writes here. So there's a quest, a hope to reach a kind of enlightening epiphany, a deeper sense of self, as Freud, might put it. And that quest is it's represented in the pattern of the poem. So it's structured around a series of encounters where the narrator observes the street and is then thrown into a cavalcade of memories. So here I've got, the instances in the poem where that happens. You see in the corner of her eye twists like a crooked pin. The memory throws up high and dry a crowd of twisted things, a twisted branch upon the beach. So the image of the woman reminds him of the branch upon the beach. The cat reminds him of the child whose hand slipped out automatic, pocketed a toy. And then the moon brings a reminiscence of sunless dry geraniums. So the repetition of these encounters represents the narrator's attempts to slip the bonds of practical memory and access pure memory. So in witnessing the pattern here, we can see the attempt, the desperation of Eliot's persona and, sort of by extension, mankind, to reach a state of wholeness or completeness. There's a yearning to bring the self to a deeper understanding of itself. So Eliot's taking the interest in human consciousness, as spearheaded by Freud, and hoping to resolve internal conflicts through Bergson's theories. And he does have some success. So we can have a look at the stanza where he looks at the moon, and we're presented with these images. The reminiscence comes of sunless dried geraniums and dust in crevices, smells of chestnuts in the streets, and female smells in shuttered rooms, and cigarettes in corridors, and cocktail smells in bars. So we know that stream of consciousness was a major stylistic feature of modernist works, and it reflected the unordered nature of the mind, the fractured way that we perceive things and assimilate information. And in Rhapsody, the way these images come one after the other with no apparent connection or logic suggests that he has entered into a stream of pure consciousness. And I also think, I chose this stanza in particular because, you get that through the polysign deton as well, the and that begins those lines, and seems to, stack these images one atop the other, the way that the, narrator wants to, or seems to be accessing a purer, more intuitive state of being. And then this burgeoning hope builds and reaches a climax in the final stanza, or it breaks in the final stanza. So the narrator reaches an epiphany, right? Memory is the metaphoric key to transcending the dualistic nature of existence. And, this is another allusion to Bergson, who believed that pure memory was key to liberating consciousness from its divided condition. And the metaphor here is also a pun. The narrator is remembering that he has the key to the door. And there's a clue to the dual meaning of those lines, that this apparent epiphany is about to be eclipsed by a different kind of realization. But I think that you can see that, that metaphor there is we can read it as hopeful or excited, right? Even the way that there's that exclamation mark after memory, the exclamatory punctuation that suggests excitement. But because this is a poem by T.S. Eliot, we can't have it end happily. So we, as we'll see, Eliot ultimately concludes that our divided self is innate. Dualism is intractable. It can't be changed. It can't be removed. It's inherent within us. So then, the audience is left to question, well, what are we left with? Eliot then presents us with this view of mankind that is fundamentally broken, mechanized, and morally debased. And that's really apparent in the last stanza of the poem. The narrator has to come back to reality. He has to brush his teeth, put his shoes away, go to bed. And this in juxtaposition to the strange beauty of pure memory and its appropriately lyrical imagery. It's really mundane and practical. The narrator fails to transcend the divided self. Gray writes that there is nothing rhapsodic about these lyrics as they develop the ironic and highly unromantic vision of nocturnal existence. So, very mundane images that, they're not loaded with the kind of mystery or symbolism as those previous images, of the crab or of the dry geranium. And then we have the final line, which is set apart from the rest of the poem. And, that structural decision makes the reader treat this statement as a coda. Its separateness heightens the drama and soul-crushing nature of its revelation. These nightly necessities are the last twist of the knife. And Brooker writes that this coda is an expression of the pain inherent in the realization that the chasm between intellect and feeling, mind and body, cannot be bridged. So the violent image of the knife twisting the body is a representation of the painful recognition that there is no escape, no transcendence, partly because this condition is ingrained in life itself, which consists of the repetition of identical hours, days, and years. The speaker is left with the horror of unmitigated ennui. And so that's the epiphany that Eliot's persona reaches. That's the deeper understanding of that innate, inherent brokenness of mankind. And so with that in mind, we can cast an eye backwards over the poem with a more cynical eye. And what we're left with, what are we left if man is unable to transcend its divided state? Well, stanza 3 suggests a wasteland of kinds. All the images here, as Shadi Gex remarks, are dead, broken, discarded, useless. So the image of the sex worker in the alley reminds the author of modernity's deterioration or debasement. And similarly, the images in stanza 4 are linked in the way that they illustrate practical memory at work. The cat that instinctively goes for the rancid butter, the child that instinctively and greedily grabs the toy car, the crab that instinctively grabs the stick. So in this collection of images, Eliot seems to be reminding us that practical memory, memory that's ingrained in the body reflexively, is inescapable. So these images, when we first read them, we might think of them as sort of chaotic, illogically collected. But really, they are united in the way that they remind us of the dominance of practical memory. And then finally, in stanza 6, we get images that remind the audience of modernity's moral debasement. So the female smells, which is suggestive of prostitution, and corridor cigarette smells from the men who visit visit these women for their base services. And the cocktail smells. We can cast our eye back, or we can think again of Preludes and the way that Eliot's sort of preoccupied with modernity's deterioration, the way that he uses the sex worker as a symbol of that debasement, and is very critical of the masquerade, the busyness of man that is a mask, right? So we've got the cocktail smells in bars, another mask that is just simply hiding the debasement which is at work in the city. So that is my very quick rundown of Rhapsody on a Windy Night. There's obviously much more in that poem, but that is a distillation I think that should be helpful